Well, I appreciate the invitation to be here again this morning. I'm not sure I can live up to the standard that Michael has set in his lessons. He's ever had some outstanding lessons, and I started calling him a preacher. Well, I've got good news and bad news this morning. Good news is this sermon has 4 points, but I've only decided to use one. And the bad news is this is a little after 10. This is when I normally preach at Wall on Sunday, so I may forget I'm not at Wall, and preach up till maybe 11:45, but I don't think that's going to happen. On November the 2nd, 1961, on the Ed Sullivan Show, and some of the younger folks here today may not know who Ed Sullivan is. If you don't know who he is, just raise your hand. Well, here's one up here. Got my work is cut out for me this morning. But he had a variety show on television. It was very interesting. People made fun of him the way he talked, but he would bring the latest talent in. I remember when he had the Beatles on there. Well, on this day, November the 2nd, 61, he brought in a little lady with a big voice. Her name was Brenda Lee. And in the next few days, if you have not already heard it, you're going to be hearing her sing "Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree." It's a popular song. But she had another song that was entitled Fool Number One. Fool Number One. And she evidently was a jilted lover. And she said, "Am I fool number one or fool number two? How many other girls have been fooled by you? I suppose that the number is far from being small, but," she said, "I'll bet I'm the biggest fool of all." Well, I don't know about that, but the word fool is a word that we hear a lot today, and probably about 99.9% of the time is used out of context. Used to be some TV show on that had a man, his name was Mr. T. And that's what he did. He went around calling everybody a fool. Evidently, he had never read what our Lord said in the 5th chapter of Matthew in verse 22, when he said, "But I say unto you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be in danger of the judgment. And whosoever shall say to his brother, Reka," which is a term of contempt, he said, "he shall be in danger of the judgment, of the council rather. But I say unto you that everyone who shall say to his brother, Thou fool, shall be in danger of the hell of fire." That's a scary verse. The Bible is not about what kind of pronouns to use. It's not about what is politically correct. If a person steals, he's called a thief. If he kills an innocent person, he is a murderer. The Bible is merciless in its terminology. If one lives a life of folly, true to his unswerving attitude towards sin, the Bible calls him a fool. Now, when we look in the Bible, we see a lot of different characters. One of my favorite sermons to preach is a character sermon, because every character that's in the Bible is in there for a reason. It's not like, and I know nobody at this school would ever do this, but if the teacher assigns a term paper, I know nobody here would just put in a lot of filler You know, if a teacher says it's got to be 16 pages, I know you will not do that. Nor does the Bible do that. There's nothing in the Bible that's put in there as a filler. There's a reason for it. And when we read of certain individuals who are called a fool by God, there's a reason for it. We want to come back to this line of thought for a moment, but in 2 Samuel 3 and verse 23, David said of his friend Abner, he said, should Abner die the death of a fool? When we look at the pictures of those in the Bible that are called fools, it's almost like looking into a mirror. Civilizations change. People change in the way they look, the clothes they wear, the places they live, transportation, communication. But basically, human nature is pretty much the same as it was in the Garden of Eden. I'd say about 99.9% the same as in the Garden of Eden. And when we look at these characters in the Bible, we are looking at ourselves. We're looking at pictures of the past. Now, the one fool that we want to discuss this morning is Abner. In the war between Saul and David, and there are a lot of emotions involved in the relationship that Saul and David had. David, of course, made a lot of mistakes, but at heart, he was a good man. And the Bible says he was a man after God's own heart. And in this war between Saul and David, they pretty much said you need to choose a side. And Abner had slain Asahel, who was the brother of Joab. Now, Abner had not always been good to David. In fact, he associated and worked with Saul to track down David. He wanted to do David harm. But if you'll read in that chapter there, 2 Samuel chapter 3, David, when Abner was slain, was very, very sad about it. He wept. He wept. He loved him. But in the Old Testament, 2 Samuel chapter 3, they had back in those days certain cities that if a person committed a killing that was not intended, I guess maybe today I'm not a lawyer. I guess it'd be manslaughter maybe. And if they had killed somebody unwittingly, they could go to one of these 6 cities of refuge. One of these cities was Hebron. And so when Joab killed Abner, that's what he did. Joab looked at himself as an avenger of blood, even though Abner, who had killed his brother, killed him in battle. So I'm not real sure why he was eligible to go in the city of refuge, but that's where he was, in the city of refuge, that is, Abner. But Abner did something very foolish. Joab went down to, or over, as the case may have been, to the city of Hebron, and he could see Abner inside the city of refuge. Now, of course, Abner lived a long time ago. He didn't have television to look at. He didn't have a cell phone where he could be talking to his friends. And Joab saw him up near the front of the city of refuge in the gate. And he, I guess it would depend on the translation, spoke kindly to him. We don't know what he said to him. He may have said, "How you like this weather?" Or he may have said, how's the food in there? But he pretended that he was really interested in him, just wanted to talk to him, and he got him to come outside the gate there of Hebron. You know what he did then? There was a flash of steel, and he stabbed Abner, and there he lay in a pool of blood, dying. Well, when King David heard it, it must have been one of those occasions where he just scratched his head and said, why? Why would he go outside the city of refuge? He said, should Abner die as a fool dieth? Well, if the Bible calls him a fool, I guess we can say that he was a fool. Because all he had to do was just stay in the city. I don't think they were working him. I don't think they were beating him. I don't think they were starving him. He just had to stay in the confines of the city of Hebron. But in our next few minutes, let's just see if we can reason why he died the death of a fool. Well, in your mind, I'm not asking you to make a verbal response, but why would you think that he died the death of a fool? Did anybody make him go outside the city of refuge? It's not unusual to hear in places like Chicago or New York of where somebody is down to get on a subway and then some lowlife pushes them off on the tracks. Well, nobody pushed Abner outside the gate. He placed himself in the hands of the enemy. By doing so, obviously he lost his life. By doing so, he grieved David. Even though he had done a lot of things against David, David still loved him. And he was deeply, deeply hurt. And he said in essence a little later on that the family of Joab, to paraphrase, you're going to pay for it for a long time. He didn't like it at all. The New Testament teaches us in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 12, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. In 1 Thessalonians 5 in verse 22, we are told to abstain from the appearance of evil. Now, should not Abner had known that Joab was the appearance of evil? He was after him. He died the death of a fool because he perished right at the gate of salvation. I'm afraid today that not many people are interested in salvation. Or they may be interested in their physical salvation. Somebody comes up with a new product that claims to do this. You can lose weight, or you can build big muscles, or whatever it might be. And they're interested in that for a while. But are people really interested in the salvation of their souls? Must not be. Because when I go to church on Sunday, I can see the streets are full of people, and I don't think they're headed to church. They're not interested in spiritual matters. They're not interested in the salvation of their souls. But let's think about that term, perishing at the gate of salvation. What about an individual who maybe grew up in a Christian home? Or what about a person who has attended worship services for years, attended thousands of services, many gospel meetings? And in this day and age, all you have to do is get on YouTube and you can hear just about anybody from the past or present with excellent lessons. I read of a man in Oregon, and you may say, well, this is a preacher story. It might be, because I don't know him personally, but I know somebody else in a similar situation. At the age of 11, he wanted to obey the gospel. His dad said, "You're too young. You're too young." And so a few years passed, and when he was 16, he started to obey the gospel again, but apparently in the service where he was thinking about obeying the gospel, he looked over at some of his friends, and they were laughing. You know what a 16-year-old assumes when he looks at somebody and they're looking at him laughing? They're making fun of him, he thought. But he later found out that was not true at all. 2 years later, he attended a great gospel meeting. There was good singing. He entered into it. There were people who were obeying the gospel, and he rejoiced with them that they were obeying the gospel. What about him? Well, he still had some interest, but he didn't have the interest that he had a few years earlier. When the meeting closed, he said, "I am further away from God than I've ever been." Well, he didn't stop attending. He attended faithfully. But it had no effect on him. And he said, I suppose it was to a friend of his, that when you hear of my death, you will know I died outside the church. And sometime later, I don't know how many years it was later, his friend did receive word that this individual had passed away. And then they said at the bottom of that note, he died outside the church. What a sad thing, to be close to obeying the gospel. There was a young man that I knew when I preached over in East Alabama who, I forget his age, but he wanted to obey the gospel, but his mother said, "You're too young." A few years later, on a Sunday afternoon, he perished. The sister driving a car, I don't know, somewhere around Camp Hill, he lost his life. It was a terrible, terrible situation. His mother said that she felt like a part of her heart had been cut out, and I'm sure that was true. But the point of this lesson is that we can see a lot of examples today of maybe us, maybe somebody we know, who's just like Abner, who gets up right at the gate of salvation, and they don't do what they're supposed to do. He really didn't have to do anything. He could just stay in there. But he perished at the gate of salvation. No wonder the end that David said, should Abner die as a fool died.